On May 31st, 2018, Monica Nowak, a pseudonym, was in her room in Lesko, Poland, when she began to hear strange music coming from seemingly nowhere. It sounded like a choir of moans. She opened her window and stuck her head out to look. She could not pinpoint the direction for which the sounds came. It was as if they were coming from everywhere. At around 10 p.m., Monica, a religious woman, despite being a little weirded out by the music, decided to make a trip to the nearby church and pray the rosary. As she approached, she noticed something peculiar in the area of the church. There was a straight line or streak similar to a rainbow coming from the sky. It seemed to brighten the entire west side of the sky. After a while, at a distance of about 100 meters, she noticed something terrifying hovering above a nearby house. She saw two dark creatures clearly visible against the glow of the nearby village. The creatures were turned sideways over the chimney of the house. Monica claimed that they resembled the description of demons from medieval times. One of the creatures was shorter than the other, and details such as pointed ears, serrated heads, and horns were noted. Both figures had a short tail, like the classic devil from Polish folklore. The figures hovered motionless, and the largest one appeared to have an eye on the back of its head, but she could not accurately determine this. Behind the house above which the creatures were hovering, there was a tall tree that protruded from the roof of the house. However, while the creatures were in sight, the tree was somehow not visible. Terrified, Monica left the area. She notified a UFO researcher, and the case was eventually published in the Arkazima website. She was reluctant to talk about the case beyond the initial report, and no further details were provided. November 20th, 1982, Stephen Meeks and another motorist were traveling northbound on Highway 49 in Coulterville, California, when both of their vehicles suddenly stopped. Neither Meeks nor the other person could quite discern what the problem was, and eventually both got out of their vehicles to talk. It was at this moment they witnessed something odd. Their report was filed with the Mariposa Sheriff's Department. According to them, off in the distance in the hilly terrain between Bear Valley and Coulterville, a strange object seemed to descend from the sky. The two drivers stood mesmerized as the object came down, seemingly to land. At that point, the driver of the second vehicle reached into his car and retrieved a camera. He began taking pictures of the craft. As if realizing that it was being filmed, the object suddenly started emitting, quote, unearthly sounds, which, for some reason, frightened Meeks and the other driver. They both jumped into their cars, which were inexplicably working properly again, and fled the scene. The Sheriff's Department officials could not find the driver of the second car, nor could they verify Meeks' story. That said, Meeks' story appeared in the November 23, 1982 edition of the Merced Sun-Star. In 1976, Paul Browning was staying with his grandparents in Lynch, Kentucky. Their house was on Creekside Road. Next door was a fellow named Bart Goins. Paul had gone to school with Bart's son Ricky, and they were friends. Goins was an easygoing fellow, and Paul recalled that his house became a sort of hangout for the neighborhood kids. They would usually gather on his porch after school and sit talking, laughing, or just doing typical things that kids do. In March of that year, Paul, Ricky, and several neighborhood girls were all at the Goins home playing. On that day, Bart came out and sat with them. Bart's tone and demeanor was different than usual, and Paul got the sense that something was wrong. He proceeded to tell them a story, something that happened to him only very recently that left him shook up. Paul recalled that he seemed quite serious and was not joking at all. According to Bart, he was driving down Black Mountain toward Lynch when what he referred to as a, quote, great white owl flew toward him and then over the top of his truck. He told them that right before the gigantic winged creature appeared, something that looked like, quote, cigarette butts began sprinkling down and hitting the windshield and hood of his truck. After these embers hit the truck, almost immediately, the largest winged creature he had ever seen appeared in the distance. It flew toward him, and then, as it approached the truck by just a few feet, it flew over the top. Bart had a full-size Chevy truck, and he told him that its wingspan was so huge it covered his entire front windshield. As soon as he saw this white creature coming toward him, he slammed on his brakes and observed it fly over the top and then out of sight. Although Bart Gones passed away sometime later, Paul was intrigued that the large white creature he saw bore similarities to the now famous moth-like entity spotted by people living in and around Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Although described as an owl, Bart was completely bewildered about what the creature actually was. Many believe that the sightings of the moth-like entity in West Virginia was a forewarning of impending doom, particularly the collapse of the Silver Bridge. Curiously, on March 9, 1976, only a short time after Bart's experience, the Scotia mine disaster happened. It was considered one of the largest coal mining disasters in history, with the first explosion killing 15 coal miners, and then 2 days later, the second explosion killing 11 miners. Paul found this a very interesting coincidence. David Becerra owns and operates the Expedition Bigfoot Museum in Cherry Log, Georgia. Every year, thousands of people flock to his museum in hopes of learning more about the hairy bipedal creatures said to be lurking about in our world's forests. No surprise, many of these visitors are eager to share with Becerra their own personal stories. According to him, one day an older gentleman, the man's wife, his son, and his son's children all walked into the museum. They had driven from their home in South Georgia, and they wanted to talk to Becerra about something odd that happened to the older man back when he was 17 years old. The story was so bizarre that Becerra admitted he had trouble believing it, though the serious and concerned nature of the person telling the story, and the fact that the family seemed to share in his concern, suggested to him that it might be true. Becerra noted typically you'll have one or more family members rolling their eyes or looking around with disinterest whenever a person from said family elects to relay a story to him, though this entire family and the witness seemed quite serious, and it conveyed to him that something had happened to this man, and it greatly disturbed him. And that concern was felt by his family, whom he no doubt related the story to multiple times. The location of the incident was, quote, not far from Cherry Log. The older man told him that when he was around 17, back in 1975, he and his friend, a neighbor whom he did not know very well, another friend, and 2 girls, both of whom were sisters, had decided to go and hang out, as it was the weekend and they were restless. There was 5 of them in total, including the witness, who was the driver. The witness and the neighbor boy both lived on farms but didn't talk much. They ended up driving up to a secluded overlook area. They had beer in the van but had not yet opened them. The main witness was in the driver's seat. One of the sisters was in the passenger seat next to him, and the other 3 were in the back seat. He had just parked the van in the overlook, and they were sitting there chatting. He guesses that they had only been parked for maybe a minute or 2, when all of a sudden there was a commotion in the back of the van. He turned around, and where one of the friends was sitting, he was no longer there. Sitting in his place was an 8-foot, hairy, giant person, looking bewildered, almost shocked. Everybody in the van was screaming at this creature. None of them had any idea where the creature had come from, what the creature was, or what happened to the friend. It was absolute mayhem. The witness reached over to open the driver's side van door, which caused the interior light to come on. When he turned back around to look at where this thing was sitting, his friend was back, looking just as bewildered. Everybody was now screaming at the friend, asking how he had managed to pull such a trick, as they assumed that's what it was. However, the friend seemed completely surprised, confused. He had no idea what they were talking about, and he had no idea why they were so upset. He told Becerra, "We all plainly saw this thing sitting in the van, where my friend was at. When I turned my light on, flipped my light on, I turned around, and this thing was gone, and my friend was sitting back there. We all saw it. It wasn't a trick of the light." Apparently after this incident, the witness and the neighbor rarely spoke. It is unclear if the boy had actually somehow transformed into the hairy creature, or if he and the creature had somehow swapped places momentarily. plucked from their own respective realities and dropped into the other, with no memory of how they got there, what they did there, or how they got back. This account was featured in the documentary Paranormal Bigfoot. In my previous video, I discussed a case in which a young man claims that he encountered a strange Grim Reaper-like entity in his kitchen. He noted that the entity seemed to have a light that shone out from under its robe. Not too long after, I remembered there was another case, a man named Tim, that had called into the Rigged Reality radio show. I had transcribed that case even though he did not give an exact location beyond that it happened somewhere in the US. According to him, it was early 1990s. He was around 7 years old. It was summertime and he and his friend were outside playing on a merry-go-round. They lived in an apartment complex, one with a small park area for the building's children to play. The apartments were situated in such a way that the tenants could keep an eye on the park, and so it was not uncommon to see children outside playing late after dark. Tim recalled that it was around midnight. His friend had left for a while to go watch the Arsenio Hall show with his parents, but he eventually returned. They were spinning slowly on this merry-go-round, talking and laughing and just enjoying the evening. Then things changed. About 10 yards away from the merry-go-round there are parallel bars, and beyond that there's a swing set inside a sandbox. And we're going around real slow. We go around one time and nothing's there, right? And we go around a second time and I swear I saw a demon. It was like that sleep paralysis thing. I was instilled with so much fear I couldn't talk, I couldn't move, I couldn't do anything. When we were going around so slow, I got a real good look at him. He was probably 7 to 10 feet tall, somewhere in there. I mean super tall. The entity Tim saw was massive. It was wearing a hooded robe, not unlike what the Grim Reaper of folklore is reported to wear. It was a very commanding presence, but the interesting thing was that it was bright white, like completely white. The robe was white, everything about it was white, and from like below it had like a fog cover or mist coming up around his feet, and there was this light coming up from below shining upwards. Almost like he had come up a staircase and you couldn't see if it was from underground or something. And that wasn't even the weirdest part. When I looked at his face, he had the facial expression like he wanted to kill me. That's all I could tell for sure, is that he wanted me dead, that he wanted to kill me. He just had this look of hatred. When I turned around, the only word I could think of was terror. I was paralyzed with fear, so when I'm looking at him, when I looked at his face, I remember the expression. I remembered the emotion. But I could never, instantly that night, I couldn't remember what his face looked like. And being an artist, I should be able to remember where the nose was, the shape and structure of the eyes, cheekbones, that kind of stuff. There were no features that I could remember. It was almost like it blotted out my ability to remember it. According to Tim, the entity just stood there staring at him, and while it never physically moved, it somehow transported itself about. A mother and son in Utopia, Ontario, who claimed that they encountered a Grim Reaper-like entity in their home, also described how it seemed to teleport itself from place to place. We went around that merry-go-round once. He was there. We went around it the next time. He was gone. So that first time when I saw him, he was back maybe 20 yards, where the swing set was and the sandbox. And the third time we went around, he was gone. I felt like this relief, and that fourth time we went around that merry-go-round, he was back again, but he closed the distance by half. Now he was right next to the parallel bars. It freaked me out. He was in the same position, everything was the same, just his location was closer. At that point, me and the other guy that I was with got up and ran to his apartment. Afterwards, they both talked about what they saw, and this Tim found to be the strangest aspect of the encounter. Where Tim saw a massive all-white Grim Reaper-type figure, his friend saw a 3.5-foot-tall angelic-type being with its wings spread. It had its head cocked to the side in the same type of gesture a person might give you if you asked them a stupid question. Tim spent a great deal of his life trying to make sense of the encounter, trying to figure out what it meant, if it meant anything at all. Anyways, that's the Halloween video. Have a great Halloween, guys.